Capitalism is a system of endless production and consumption. We know from the very laws of reality that this cannot go on indefinitely. The very function of capitalism requires endless expansion. In the course of this expansion, it seeks a low cost of production and regulation. It needs weak protection for the environment, low taxation, and low labor costs. By the very nature of the laws of capitalism, it is antagonistic to the preservation of these conditions. As the cost of production rises, it eventually reaches a point when it is no longer profitable, leading to crisis. The endless consumption of capital will have to come to an end. This is where we get the phenomenon of imperialism from. This precipitated the First World War. As nations were trying to expand, they came up against each other's national boundaries. Something sooner or later was going to give, spark off a conflict they all knew was coming. That moment was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. After that, it was a mad dash to collect up as much resources as possible. Everyone wanted their slice and would do anything to justify going in and getting it. In history, this expansion has taken the form of absorbing large areas into the capitalist mode of production. This is where China comes in. Until recently, China was not a part of the larger world capitalist economy and global division of labor. The incorporation of China into the global expansion of capital signals a very troubling fact for the capitalists. The very strategic reserve pool of labor and resources has now been trapped and to this day is rising in cost. That rising cost of producing in China is a signal of the impending limit of capitalist expansion. This means the eventual rise of China will be the fall of capitalism. We're looking at a repeating cycle of rising and falling powers. Each successive power in recent history has reappeared somewhere else in a larger and larger form. The current empire of the U.S. and its economic control of the world exists in the largest proportions that has ever existed. The rise of China could very likely be an empire that is even larger than the U.S. Despite this, given what we know of capitalist expansion, it will signal the end of capitalism itself. There will be no reserve of cheap labor and resources to exploit. There's not much room left for expansion. India is stretched almost too thin, and its population is lashing back with the struggle of the Naxals. Africa, while rich in resources, is largely depopulated and sparsely populated due to the effects of slavery long ago. The rise of China as a capitalist state will most certainly use up the last of these reserves in India and Africa, which we can already see with regards to Africa. From there, we can only witness the dialectic take over. The quantity of events will accelerate into a qualitative change. What that change is, we have no idea. When capitalism comes to an end, the corresponding superstructure that flows from that base will also have to change. The development of history, according to Marxist theory, stems from society's productive forces. When these change, the underlying historical conditions change. The existing social system will also have to change because they will not be compatible. It will come that there will be no choice. The very function of capitalism is risk. In order for it to function towards sufficient profit, it must meet certain conditions. Firstly, it must produce desired commodities, things that sell. Second, it must take place through the capitalist mode of production, which requires certain things. Thirdly, it requires a large labor force to exploit and a supply of raw materials at an affordable cost. Fourthly, the capitalist must find an effective way to extract surplus value from the worker. He must then also realize that value in money form in a market that is large enough to offer a sufficient price. Along with this, the capitalist must run the risk of confiscation by the state and non-state forces via violence. These realities of the functioning of capitalism are what make it impossible for capitalism to be a self-sustaining process. Capitalism, by its very nature, a self-destructive and contradictory system. Wherever it expands to, value also flows. This, along with competition from other capitalists, both domestic and foreign, causes a rise in costs. These costs include environmental costs, labor, and taxes. Historically, this has occurred with geographical expansion, which required capital to be expanded into new areas with lower cost. As a prime example, we can give the moving of manufacturing initially into Mexico, then to China, when profit rates were too low in North America. Thus, we see the material limits of capital, the conquering of the entire world. About the mid-20th century, China became part of the global economy as the necessary industrial and technical capabilities were just being constructed. The massive labor power of the countryside had not been utilized and remained unorganized economically. They were only becoming a part of the global division of labor. As China begins to increase its wealth, the proletariat of the nation will gain economic and political power. This will increase taxation as the working class demands a greater share of the surplus value they generate. Primarily, this will manifest itself in social programs, benefits, and increased wages. This will have the effect of increasing the cost of production or lowering the rate of profit. Normally, in this case, the global capitalist system simply reorganizes production to a more profitable geographical location, a location that no longer exists. There is another important point to be made here about the sustainability of capitalism and profitability. Aside from what we have already described, as a middle class in China rises, it will begin to consume more and more resources, which will place a greater strain on demand. Even if 20% of China's 1.39 billion population becomes middle class, comparable to the US middle class, we're looking at 278 million people. Consider what astronomical amounts of wealth and resources the US middle class already consumes. Now add an additional 278 million people on top of that. The strain on the collection of natural resources will skyrocket at a time when the affordability of labor for those same resources becomes scarce. This would no doubt cause a huge price increase as demand and labor costs go up. We must ask the question, is there enough in the way of resources in our current consumption pattern for it to be sustainable? The answer is obviously no. This drying up and unprofitability of resources will cause huge shifts in the market as wealthier classes vie for what's left of them. This will leave the great majority of the poor without enough to survive on, or, at the very least, a barely manageable level of reproduction. This lack of adequate resources will cause increased social antagonisms that will lead to great social upheavals, leaving the door open for revolution and change. This dwindling supply and increasing cost of resources will push the capitalist system into more and more wars, as each of the national bourgeois push for their own individual interests. I think this demonstrates that the integration of China into the capitalist system would spell the end of capitalism itself. Capitalism, like a mindless animal, will eat up all of its food and cause itself to starve, leaving it only to look at itself and its own self-destructive nature. Thank you for watching. Please comment and rate the video. If you liked it, hit subscribe or check out some of these other great videos. If you wish, share it on social media. While you're at it, why don't you follow me on Twitter? And if you got time, go on over to the MRN bookstore and check out some of the latest books available.